Her hair, it was black and curly. Her cheeks were a chestnut red. On her breast she wore white nylon. There I long to lay my head. Okay, well, this is, hey, howdy, Owen. This is my first attempt at doing a live Q&A. So I think what I'm going to do to start, I didn't know this would actually work, so we're actually live with people now. Cool. But if anybody has a question, type it out to me. I'll answer it. In the meantime, I'll get us warmed up. I've got some questions that I'm already ready for here. So here's a question from Thomas. Thomas says, are your bridges sometimes closer to the rim or tailpiece than what might be more typically taught? Oh, hell, I've already done this question. Richard asks, I've noticed that many of the 1880 to 1890 banjos feature, or that I feature, have metal pots. So was that the norm back then? Thanks, Richard. Well, Richard, it became something of a norm in that period you're talking about 1880 to 1890. It did become something of a norm. But you see, this banjo is probably made after that period, maybe 1910, 1920. And they've started to go away from that again. And then if you look at like our modern bluegrass banjos today, you don't find that the metal rim usually that you're looking at, it's not a solid metal rim. It's what they call spun over, or it's clad in metal. So what it is, it's a wooden rim, usually much thinner than what this one is. And they've spun sheet metal over the top and bottom to make it like punchier and louder and stuff. It was something they did in the days before they were really developing resonators as a way to, I think, try to make the banjo project a little bit more, have a tighter, punchier sound, the sound I really like. So yeah, but they were doing that. I want to say the earliest banjo that somebody slapped a sheet metal. Oh, hey, Jonas, how you doing, buddy? I think the earliest banjo I've ever heard of them slapping that sheet metal cladding on it was as early as the 1850s, I want to say. But it's very rare to find an instrument like that. It didn't catch on. I know in the 1870s, people started doing it again. There's, hey, Nick, good morning, buddy. I think there was what they call the New York School of banjo makers, that you'll hear collectors and some contemporary makers talk about a New York school. So that's where, like, this style peg head, they would call that a New York school peg head, because they kind of really favored that hourglass shape with a little bit of fancies up top, right? So some of those boys in the 1870s, they started cladding their rims. I sold a banjo on this channel last year, a real pretty banjo that we think came out of the Buckbeak factory, and it had a metal clad rim. And I'll bet you that was a 1870s banjo. It kind of had 1870s written all over it to me, which would be considered an early banjo and an early spun over rim. But yeah, so by 1880, 1890, almost every banjo they were making that was marketed as a good banjo had the metal-clad rim, and then they started adding, you know, lots of hooks. You guys know about that old cliche: the more hooks, the better banjo. Blasey, blasey. So Nick over here. Oh, good morning, Robin. Nick in Pennsylvania. He says he's curious as to my opinion on non-tipped bridges for gut or nylon strings. Okay, so this is my position has evolved on this. I was recently talking to Jerron Paxton, and if you guys don't know Jerron Paxton, he's known as Blind Boy Paxton a lot. Look him up. Real good banjo player. He's really gotten into the nylon string classical playing. So I didn't think there was any difference. What Nick is talking about, see, this is a capped bridge. It's a black ebony cap that's on a hard maple foot, okay? And this has got three feet on it, 3 legs. So Jerron was telling me that he thinks this type of bridge don't sound good on nylon strings. And I didn't think I was like, whatever, you know, but I have enough bridges. I got home and started trying that out. Nobody had ever told me that before. And I think he's right. If you put, if I take this bridge off of here, and if I put on a solid maple bridge, a really thin, this is a nice thin bridge, but a nice thin, solid maple bridge, it does to my ear make these nylon strings crack a little bit. You know, that banjo sound that we're after. And consequently, I think, yeah, if you put like a solid bridge on a steel string banjo, it's definitely going to sound different. I don't know if you're going to prefer that or not, but there's something about that ebony cap that seems to really work well with metal strings, and the concept works better than with nylon and gut. I don't know why that is. For some reason, the nylon and gut strings, they want to transfer their sound through that solid rock maple bridge, you know. So I'm going to pull up another one of my predetermined questions that I had lined up. So Reynald says, do you have any tips on keeping the volume up in your singing? I noticed that I need to really play softly in order to even hear myself while singing and playing the banjo. Well, yeah, that's one thing that a lot of people do, especially like new people who are new to singing and stuff. And depending on the banjo you could have a really loud banjo, and most of us have been trained from a young age to be like pretty quiet. Hey, Ken, thanks. Free haircut. Most of us have been trained from a young age not to holler and shout and do stuff that banjo players do. So there's that. You have to get over the mentality. Like when you first start singing, you're going to want to whisper because you don't want to annoy anybody, or you don't want to sound foolish or anything like that. But the problem, so when if you're on the street or you're on stage, or if you're playing in a band, even if it's just for y'all's own amusement, for the singer to be heard, you kind of have to belt it out. Now, when the first time I really noticed somebody belting out the lyrics like that was I was a little kid, and I had just got a Leadbelly CD. It was like the best of Leadbelly or whatever, one of those compilations. And one thing I instantly noticed about Leadbelly was the way he sings. I think Hank Williams sings similarly. To me, both of those guys, especially Leadbelly, they always sounded like a trumpet, like they're a human trumpet. Like when Leadbelly sings, he's like, bah, you know, it comes out sharp and he cuts it off sharp. It's a blaring, and he's trumpeting his throat. So, you know, these are guys who learned to sing outdoors, you know, like Leadbelly was singing on the damn Chain Gang. So, you know, he knew how to belt it out. So, you know, we didn't grow up on chain gangs, and most of us didn't grow up in the fields and stuff anymore, hooting and hollering. So you've got to really belt it out when you sing. The other piece of advice, all kinds of people will tell you this, you know, most of us in our day-to-day language, we're speaking from our throat and maybe just the top part of our lungs. And so when we sing, people do the same thing. They sing only using their face and their throat and maybe the upper part of their lungs. Somebody told me early on that to really sing, you got to sing from, like, you know, the bottom of your pelvis sing as if you're singing from your ass up, like deep in your guts, up through your throat and blare it out. Or, oh, like I don't really know how to explain it, but you'll notice you're probably singing from up here. Try singing from down here. The other thing is you may just have an extremely loud banjo, which that's for you to work out. Owen asks if I've ever heard of Homer Ledford. No, I've heard of Lily Mae Ledford, who's a famous female banjo picker from East Kentucky. But I've never heard of Homer Ledford. I mean, can you tell me who that is? I guess I could look him up. But, I'm going to pull up another question. I'm so backed up on these questions. So Tim says, I'm curious to know what you think are the best dance tunes on the banjo. Those ones where you just want to get up and start clogging. Which tunes do you think of when you want to have that effect on people? Okay. Well, obviously, hook and line. This banjo is all kinds of out of tune, but hook and line, you guys have heard me play that a million times. Pretty much any tune you see me doing that. That's called walking the fingerboard or fanning the neck, people call it. Anytime you see me doing that in a tune, that's a tune that I think that in my mind, I think, wow, this is a really good dance tune, because to me, that's a dance lick. Snook on the hook and the bass on the line. Ain't nobody got a chop like mine. So hook and line is a must have dance piece. Cumberland Gap, that's a great dance piece that people have been dancing to for a long time. Little Birdie is a tune that a lot of people shy away from because to do it right, it's difficult to play and it's difficult to sing. And people don't think of it as a dance tune. The people generally think of it as just sort of one of those odd banjo tunes, right? Like you don't ever hear a fiddle player play Little Birdie and sing it at the same time. It's like a banjo thing, right? But George Gibson, one of my original early banjo mentors, who taught me almost everything I know, as you guys know, George told me when he was young, when he first heard Little Birdie and was first learned it, the old timer, I think the old timer he learned it from, told George that when he was a boy, he had worn out a new pair of shoes dancing to Little Birdie. Just one night of dancing all night to the same song. And that's something too people forget. Like at these old school square dances back in the day, occasionally you hear little fleeting references of like what they were playing, how they played it, stuff like that. And so that really, a lot of times what it was, at least in Southeast Kentucky back in as early as the late 1800s at least, you generally had a solo banjoist and he might play one tune over and over again all night. The dancers didn't care. They wanted rhythm. They wanted the music to be good, but mostly they were just there to dance and drink. So they don't really care that you're playing the same tune over and over again, right? So that's the thing. And also, if you've ever been to one of these things and there's so much commotion and stomping and stuff, if you're playing an early instrument, nobody can hear you anyhow. All they can hear is the rhythm cutting through. And so to me, that's why hook and line was one, and it's also known as minnow on the hook and shout Lulu in other parts of Appalachia in the South. That is why that's one of the most widespread, most popular dance songs, because the rhythm is so simple and it cuts, Shout, Lulu, shout your best. Old grandmammy gone to rest. Shout, Lulu, shout, shout. What in the hell you shouting about? And so on and so forth. My favorite instrumental banjo tunes. You know that little gal, Nora Brown. You guys should look her up. This young banjo player, and I'm actually proud to say that I got her under my wing a couple of times and sat with her and showed her some stuff. And I know she's gone and she's learned a lot of stuff from George Gibson and John Haywood and them guys directly. So that's great. But Nora Brown reminded me. I saw her playing this tune. It's called Wild Goose Chase or Lost Gander. I'd only ever heard Virgil Anderson pick that. And I heard her playing that, and that was really cool. And I had never even attempted to play it. And so I picked up the banjo and twisted the knobs around and played that. That's a really neat instrumental tune. It's called Lost Gander or Wild Goose Chase, something like that. And there's got to be others, like, of course, Coal Creek March. I think the first time I ever heard Coal Creek March, it might have actually been Reed Martin. When I was a young kid, I saw Reed Martin. If you guys aren't familiar with him, he's a real good, like round peak style, real technical picker. He never sings anything that I know of. And I think the first time I ever heard Coal Creek March, Reed Martin played it. And that about blew my mind. I was 13 years old, just some kid living in Florida, and I couldn't really pick the banjo quite yet, So that blew my mind. There's got to be a lot of them out there, but you guys know me. I don't do a lot of instrumental stuff. Even if I'm picking an instrumental tune, damn fool that I am, I might sing out. Look how popular I am. Everybody wants a hold of me. Okay, I'm getting backed up here. Oh, and you say your grandfather sold the guy wood to make instruments. I don't know. Where did he live? I mean, Ledford, but the name like Ledford, he sounds like he might have been up in Appalachia somewhere. I don't know. So the tree leader gardener says, "Good morning. I just bought me a banjo and I want to know how to get the tone GCGCD for hook and line." Well, that's simple. I'm going to tell you all how to tune your banjo to double C for hook and line. So take your voice and sing the lowest note you can, or the lowest comfortable note, let's say. So I tune my banjo in double C to where the bass string matches sort of the bottom end of my voice. And then you're going to note your bass string, that fourth string, noted at the 7th fret. Make your third string sound the same. So twist your third string knob until it sounds the same as your fourth string when it's noted at the 7th fret. Okay, now take your open fourth string and make your second string sound the same as it open. Match those. Then you're going to note your second string at the 2nd fret and make the first string match it. Make them sort of match. Then you're going to note your first string at the 5th fret and make your thumb string match it. So you should come up with something that sounds sort of like that. You get a line, I'll get a pole. We'll run down to the fishing hole. And anyhow, you can look that up on the internet. It's easy to look up, or just get an electric tuner. Okay. So Nick in Pennsylvania says, most are aware of banjo's connections to some specific regions, and some regions are known for their general banjo approaches. Are there lesser known regional banjo styles that you'd like to spotlight? Well, Nick, of course, one lesser known regional banjo style that I like to spotlight is like the East Kentucky stuff. And especially, once you start learning about East Kentucky banjo and just music in general, you realize that you can't even generalize it so much as to call it an East Kentucky banjo style, because really, no two people in any of these regions played alike. Especially in East Kentucky, it seems like you had just real diversity in styles. And George Gibson talks about reasons why he thinks that is. And if you're interested in those sort of overlooked styles, I do recommend you pick up a copy of the new documentary and album that we were all a part of that Folkways just put out, Mike Seeger's last documentary. It's called Just Around the Bend. So grab that. There's actually a whole CD that's mostly either Kentucky musicians or guys like me and Matt Kinman, who are not from Kentucky, but we learned a lot of our music from Kentucky musicians, namely George Gibson. So that style, which you can refer to that as overhand, or just that's what the most common term in East Kentucky historically seems to have been overhand. They also called it drop thumb. That was another common one in East Kentucky. Really, the most common terminology that you hear historically out of Kentucky is they just said playing the banjo. Old timers didn't really differentiate between different styles. It's almost, I think it was expected that you would have your own style. You wouldn't, in the old days, you wouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't copy somebody note for note, because there was no material, there were no teachers. It'd be impossible to do that. You learn by ear. So all the styles were different. Another thing, Bob Winans has a good article at the very end of that new book that came out in 2018, Banjo Roots and Branches. So grab that book too if you're really interested in this stuff. Bob Winans goes into a lot of detail about a style that seems to have existed kind of on the periphery of Appalachia in the South. We might call it a Piedmont style. It's that two-finger picking. So two-finger and up picking seem to have been more prevalent in the Piedmont areas. And by Piedmont, y'all understand, I mean like sort of not the high Appalachian mountains in the west, but the foothills, mostly to the south and east of Appalachia. So when you're here in North Georgia and up into parts of East Tennessee, and I imagine northern Alabama, and definitely in the Piedmont of North Carolina, according to Bob Winans, he identifies what he considers a unique Piedmont banjo style. It's a two-finger picking style, up-picked picking style. And I'd have to read that again, but think of like Charlie Poole, guys like that. I think there was more finger picking once you got off the mountain. The others, and then the old down picking style, the overhand style, was more prevalent in the high mountains for some reason. That's the way it looks to me right now. Another name that people in Kentucky used for what we call clawhammer today, they called it hoedown. So you had hoedown, drop thumb, and you had overhand. Those were names that were used. All right, I'm going to back up and try to get some of these questions. I really appreciate y'all participating this morning. This is my first time doing a live one. So Sean asks if I have any thoughts on Clifftop and similar old-time festivals. I haven't been to the festivals in a long time. Y'all have seen probably some other videos I put out where I maybe didn't say the best things about the festival scene. But I don't think I've ever trashed it too hard. And one festival I've never trashed is Clifftop. That's the one festival I went to. There was a period of about 5 years when I lived up there, from maybe about 2008 to 2012 or so, something like that, where I went to a lot of those summer festivals. So I went to, Laurel Bloomery, Merlefest, Galax, Clifftop, the Appalachian States little fiddlers convention they do there. I've been to some others I can't even think of. So, me, I don't really do well in festival scenes or really human groups in general. I tend to get run out of. Some of y'all have even seen me get run out of a group of humans recently on the internet. So I tend to get run out of groups. So I was never big on festivals or the competitions, but I got to say, if there's one festival that I really enjoyed, it was always Clifftop. I like the atmosphere at Clifftop. You're camping in the woods on that nice little ridge, and it has sort of that homey, safe atmosphere at Clifftop. I always had a good time at Clifftop. It was one of the festivals where I felt they were a little bit more welcoming, because I was always an outsider. I was from Florida, and so people knew that. And you're considered an outsider. And it's like if you're a Floridian who also maybe runs his mouth and can pick the banjo a little bit too good, then certain people are really down on you, But anyhow, Clifftop wasn't like that. So I do like Clifftop. If I was going to go to a festival again, that's the one that I think about going. I've also heard about Black Pot down in Louisiana. I've never been to that one. I've only been to Louisiana one time, and that was to go play a show in New Orleans like last year. Was the only time I've ever been to Louisiana. So I'd like to go to Black Pot sometime, maybe. I love Cajun music. But you guys, Sean, you know my opinion about the festivals. There's uh, like the style of music that's played at festivals. I wouldn't really call it traditional or old time music. It's festival music. You have festival banjo style. You have the festival fiddle style, where they're like tuned up real high and the fiddle player dominates every string band and stuff. It's festival stuff. It's almost like sort of urban educated people in an effort to revive, these sort of dying out, or traditions that were perceived as lost and dying out. In order to try and revive that, what they actually did, this is an idea that I've got from George Gibson. George will tell you what they actually did. Instead of reviving an old tradition, they created a new tradition, which, if you think about it, that's actually really interesting. These basically these lost urban academic kids in the 50s and 60s, they came out of places like DC and New York and Baltimore and stuff, and they many of them actually transplanted to the mountains, and they spent their lives and they've staked their careers on reviving old time music, being revivalists. But they haven't done that at all, because you can see that there's a lack of continuity between the current old time traditions and actual old time traditions that we can read about and catch glimpses of through historical resources. Right? There's a break in the continuity, and it's about 1960 or so, once the old ways had pretty much died out, and we've gotten 20 years past the Second World War. Then things like clawhammer banjo emerge once urban elites start noticing places like Round Peak, places like Daisy, Kentucky, stuff like that. Then they try to revive it, but it's gone, and they're outsiders. So what they wound up doing was creating a new tradition. So that's what we're seeing today. If you go to Clifftop today, if you go to Galax or Merlefest, these festivals, you'll see glimpses of old time. There's still one or two old timers around. There are people who, I think, like myself, I'd like to think, are still trying to champion the old ways, the old songster, dance tradition, banjo ways. But by and large, when you go to these festivals, you're going to see festival banjo, and you're going to hear festival music, and that's fine. I don't want anybody to think that I'm making a dig at it. I'd like to go back to Clifftop one day and hang out, see everybody, and hear some of that good festival music. But don't confuse that with traditional music or folk music. It's not a folk festival. It's an old time festival. So it's a very new tradition. But don't let me discourage you from going. You should go and enjoy yourself. So Rod P asks me, do you have any interest in playing metal strings? So now I'm coming around on this too. I keep having these conversations with Jerron Paxton. So y'all got to be careful. If you talk to Jerron, he'll have you changing your mind about a lot of stuff. He's had me change my mind on bridges and action height and neck angle and all kinds of things that maybe other people tried to tell me and I didn't listen to them. But anyhow, I'm kind of over metal strings at this point. That could change, but I'm kind of to the point where I don't want to play metal strings right now. And why is that? So I have to go way back in time. So when I first started playing and when I was a youngin', like when I entered my first banjo contest at the age of 16, and the judges actually disqualified me because they said I did not play old time. That was at one of the Florida Old Time Music Championship, I think. I was disqualified because I didn't play old time banjo. Anyhow, that's crazy. One thing I did that probably pissed him off was I went up there with a nylon strum banjo, you don't do that, you know. That's traditional, but it's not old time. You see, that's a break in the continuity that we're talking about. So whereas the piece that I played at that festival probably would not have been out of place at an 1890s banjo contest, at a 1990s banjo contest, it's as if I was up there speaking Greek. So after that, and I stuck with nylon strings basically going forward. I'm stubborn. I stuck with them. I preferred them. But when I got out of the Army and I moved up to Boone, North Carolina, suddenly I was around other banjo players for the first time, other guys that were my age, guys and girls who picked. And that was a wonderful thing. It was intimidating and all that too, but I had to rethink how I did some stuff, right? So they all played steel strings, and my banjo sounded muddy. If I tried to play on the street, that was what really got it for me. Trying to play an antique banjo with nylon strings on the street in a busking scenario, nobody's going to hear you. You're not going to make any money. So very quickly, I got rid of those, and I put some medium gauge steel strings on my banjo. And I pretty much played only steel strings until some of you good people out there inspired me to start this project again, the Banjo Heritage Commons over on Patreon, and start doing more time with YouTube. And you guys inspired me to build more banjos and talk about them and think about them more. And in that process of building my own folk banjos, I always put nylon strings on them. And I always enjoy playing them. I like the way they sound. And it got me wanting to go back to nylon. So for me, what I'm mostly doing these days, I'm playing by myself for my own personal amusement. If I'm playing for an audience nowadays, usually I'm on stage with microphones all over me, right? They've got a mic pointed at the hide and one stuffed in my face. So I don't need steel strings if I'm on stage with microphones. I don't need steel strings if I'm filming a video for y'all. I don't need steel strings if I'm just playing for my own amusement. And since I prefer them, I'm looking to transition back that way. Now, that's not to say that you should. It's just I prefer it is an older sound. Steel strings, we know, weren't used in any kind of widespread nature until at least like 1920 or something, really, honestly. If you talk to some of these classic banjo guys like Joel Hooks and Jerron and them guys and Aaron Lewis, you know, they'll tell you all about this stuff. And that's stuff that most of us old-timey banjo pickers, you know, us old-time banjo pickers, we don't really think about. We just, you know, we put some cheap steel strings on there. We never change them. You know, we set our banjos up differently. Most of us kind of set our banjos up like bluegrassers, I've learned. Like the way that I sort of learned setting banjos up from luthiers and stuff, well, that's a bluegrass setup. I never learned from any luthier the old traditional, like a minstrel or classic banjo setup. Anyhow, I just went way long-winded on that. So Berserk 5 says, I've got a gold tone banjo that's on the lower end of things. I was wondering what, in your opinion, are the best quality improving banjo upgrades you can get without a whole new dang banjo. Okay, well, you come to the right place, my friend. Let me put another log on the fire. It's cold here for the first time. Oh, shit. Damn. That's hard to do when you're let that cook for a minute. I'm sorry, y'all, but we're working on old technology here. So you've got a gold tone banjo that's not the best. I've had those too. I cut my first banjo ever was a gold tone Cripple Creek. That my father bought that for $100 at a little music store in South Carolina called Bill's Pickin' Parlor. Anyhow, so I know what you mean. So one thing is the basic things you can do to really easily make your banjo sound better. Tailpiece, bridge, head, strings. That's the quick things the quick and dirty changes you can do. So your gold tone probably has an adjustable tailpiece. If you look closely at your tailpiece, it probably has a screw on the back. And if you twist that screw under string tension, it'll either raise or lower the angle of your tailpiece. So you want to make sure that the tension, well, adjust it to where it sounds like you want it to sound. Or get a new tailpiece, throw it out all together and get a no knot tailpiece if you want kind of that crummy old time sound. But my advice to you is to take your bridge and adjust it to where it's touching the hide, and then back it off a little bit. You don't want it touching the hide, but you want it almost touching the hide. More pressure behind the bridge is going to be better on your strings. So the other thing you can do is just experiment with different bridges. And I would just get on elderly.com and or somewhere else and just order you some different types of bridges. Try to get crow spacing if you can. The wider crow spacing is a little bit better for old time playing. Other thing you can do to your gold tone banjo is change the head. You can take, it probably has just a typical frosted plastic head. You can change that out with a skin head. You can get those pre-mounted from people like John Balch, who you can track down online. You can buy a hide, mount your own skin. You could put a fiber skin head on there. I am not very happy with fiber skin heads. I want them to be better than what they are, but they don't sound like skin. They sound like fiber skin. We can talk about that too. But if you want to maybe get that plunkier old-timey sound, maybe experiment with a fiber skin head on your gold tone banjo. You might really like the sound of it. I don't know. Or just the real quick and dirty, old school cracker ghetto way that you can do that is take your plastic frosted head off and spray paint the back of it. Just take a off-white spray paint, whatever color you want, spray paint the inside of that head and thicken it up. And that will plunky up the sound. Or change your strings. If you have, make sure you've got medium gauge strings on there. I think light gauge strings don't sound very good. You might want to try with heavy gauge strings. You can get steel strings wound third, like the wound fourth, but they also have a wound third. That imparts a nice plunky sound to the banjo. So there's all kinds of things you can do. Another trick, this is a good trick that I don't happen to have a booze cork laying around right now, but Jerron Paxton, when I was visiting him up in New York, and I'm sorry, Jerron, I'm giving away your secret because it's a neat little secret. He and I and some of us, we're always making fun of people who they stuff a sock or a handkerchief under their dowel to mute it. We just playfully make fun of that because we're of the school that thinks a banjo should be loud and crazy sounding, right? But so instead of if you want to muffle it, you could try putting a rag under there. But what sounds better, take you a wine cork and cut it down to where it fits between the dowel and the hide standing up, and position it behind your bridge so that the cork is under the hide behind the bridge, standing between the dowel and the hide. That totally changes the sound of your banjo. Makes it sound warmer, and it muffles it slightly. So there's some ideas for you, Berserk. Oh boy. Andrew DeCostas says, what do you think of the Doc Boggs 3-finger style? You seem to usually use a 2-finger style. No, that's true. My 2-finger style, y'all, I developed my 2-finger style after Doc Boggs. So I was listening to Doc Boggs as a kid. I knew how to do a little bit of that, and I knew how to do bluegrass. I can't even do it anymore. I knew how to do the 3-finger bluegrass picking, but I wanted that. I didn't like the 3-finger bluegrass stuff, and I'd gotten away from it. I threw away my finger picks, and I thought, this can't be. I was already thinking that there must be an older, more traditional way to play the banjo than what Earl Scruggs is doing, right? And so then I heard Doc Boggs, and I knew immediately, you can tell he's not using finger picks, but he is using 3 fingers. It's his own sort of 3-finger folk style. But I, for whatever reason, I'm like a real simple-minded, I'm a real minimalist kind of guy when it comes to things, I like to cut off, just trim all the fat, and let's just make it simple and call a spade, right? So why would I use 3 fingers to play my music when I can make just as pretty music with 2, and it'd be a lot more simple, right? So even as a little 13, 14-year-old kid, I was like, I'm going to use 2 fingers. So the reason I always use 2 fingers now is because I forgot any 3-finger picking I ever learned, and I cannot 3-finger pick anymore to save my life. I'm a 2-finger banjo picker. I'm an overhand drop thumb banjo picker, and I'm a hoedown up picker. I can't. The 3-finger picking is out the window for me at this point. So that's why. What do I think of Doc Boggs 3-finger picking? I love it. And anytime I hear anybody doing it, I think it's great. There's a guy on YouTube you can pull up who offered a whole lesson series on how to play Doc Boggs songs note for note. And he picks just like Doc Boggs. I'm sorry, I forget the guy's name right now, but if you look up like Doc Boggs banjo lesson, his will be the first one that pops up probably. It's really good. I love that stuff. And like I said, Andrew, the only reason that I don't play more like Doc Boggs is because I was already stuck on 2-finger picking. So I had to do everything I've done with 2-finger has been trying to interpret Doc Boggs 3-finger, trying to interpret George Gibson's 3-finger picking, or trying to interpret Roscoe Holcomb is apparently just a 2-finger picker, but he sounds like he's using about 13 fingers, right? Anyhow, I'll move on to another question. So Patrick says, I played Cripple Creek for an hour once with a fiddler. It takes a while for the groove to really set in, inducing almost a trance state. People miss the point, the hypnotic state these tunes induce. Yeah, thank you, Patrick. And I've done a video on that. If you look up Clifton Hicks and the words trance banjo, I did a pretty lengthy video where I talked about how I think specifically while 2-finger picking Little Polly, I'll slip myself into a trance every time. And what's even better than that is if you can be in a group setting with other musicians and all of you slip into that trance sort of mentality, that trance mode together, that's a really rare, beautiful thing, I think. That's really cool. And that's something that's why people are drawn to the jam scene in the first place, right? It's like, and also, I got to, our traditional old time jam scene, it didn't really exist before the 50s and 60s. That whole concept is basically borrowed from like the hippie drum circle concept where everybody sits in this equal circle and there's no solos, there's no singing, stuff like that. And you play predetermined, there's all these rules and stuff, So to me, you can get into a trance state that way. But me, I had a hard time doing that. I've never really felt comfortable in the jam scene. In a jam circle, as I have to, my banjo will have to be capoed and tuned up high, and I'm playing tunes maybe I'm not familiar with, or it's just not the way I would do it, blah, blah, blah. My own personal cross to bear, right? But that's really cool. And like Patrick is saying, I mean, you need to sit on and ruminate on that piece of music long enough to slip into that trance mode. And I think what's cool about if I'm just picking Pretty Polly or East Virginia on my own, I can slip right into that trance state like instantly. And that's something you can't take to the bank. They can't take that away from you. Like once you're able to do that, you are different. Your mind is a little bit different. Andrew says, I'm a big inspiration. Thanks, Andrew. I need to hear that once in a while. So Luca says, hello, everyone. I hope y'all are having a great day. I love the live Q&A. Did you tune down on your Shut Up in Coal Creek video? Or did you stay in F sharp D, F sharp A, D? Well, Luca, I don't know for sure, bud. But I know I wasn't tuned up all the way to standard pitch. You'll almost never hear me tune all the way up to standard pitch. So on that recording of Coal Creek, the Coal Creek Mine video that I recently put up, I was either one full step or a half step down. So instead of being like tuned to G, I was tuned to F sharp or something like that. But no, Luke, I wasn't all the way up. You'll probably never, if I'm tuned all the way up, it's very difficult for me to sing. Okay. Hey, good morning. We got our good friends over at Dulceola Recordings. I presume, Dan, you're over in Japan right now, buddy. We miss you. We miss you. Hope you get back. I hope you come back and see us. Thanks for sitting in, Dan. Y'all should check out Dulceola Recordings, Dolceola. Dulceola Recordings. That's my good friend Dan Torrigo over in Japan. He comes to the States frequently and records people that nobody else is recording. You should check out Dulceola Recordings. Rich W55 asks, what's a good cheap banjo for a beginner? Oh, the $1 million question. Well, Rich, I used to always tell people to get the Deering Goodtime. For a long time, those were only about $300. I want to say I bought mine for, back in 2003, I bought one for $300 or $400, but I know now they're getting up to about $600. But Deering Goodtime may still be the best cheap banjo for a beginner. If you've got the $500 or $600 and you just want to spend it and get a banjo that's ready to go, that you know it's not going to suck or have something wrong with it, or somebody shysted you or whatever, or Cliff sold you some antique that you hate or something, go ahead and get you the Deering Goodtime. They're a good banjo. My best advice. Other than that, you have to find a cheaper vintage one or antique, and they're not going to be near as good probably as the Goodtime. Cool. Oh, E.W. Hawkins reminds me that, yeah, the 2019 Banjo Gathering is coming up next week over there in Norfolk, Virginia. I'm not going to be in attendance this year. I didn't buy my tickets. I went last year when they held it in Bristol, Virginia, because Bristol is a lot closer to me. It's only about 4.5 hour drive for me to get to Bristol or less. But for me to drive to Norfolk, Virginia from my home here on the Tennessee-Georgia line, it was over a 10-hour drive. So, and on top of that, the expenses and stuff, and they don't pay me to go there. We have to pay to attend that event. So I couldn't go this year, but hopefully if they bring it back down, south somewhere where I can actually go, I will go. I'll go back to Bristol. If they hold it someplace like Atlanta, Birmingham, Nashville, I'll attend, because those are places that I can reach. And I'm always interested in trying to put out the olive branch as much as I can. I had a pretty good time when I went last year. Good morning, John. Rod P says he's going to try that cork idea. That's a good idea. Roger Mills says, hi, Clifton. When I tune my banjo low like you, my strings are very loose and rattle around. Any tips to stop this? So, Roger, yeah, you're getting lower string tension, so stuff is rattling and vibrating more. I kind of just learned to play that way. I like the way it sounded, kind of old and stuff, but you might have a problem where it's worse. One thing you can do, tighten your head. If the head is loose, then that reduces tension, and that makes things buzzier and stuff. Make sure your tailpiece is everything's tightened down and ratcheted down. One of the things you can do if you're going to lower tunings is go to a heavier string gauge. So if you're using light gauge strings right now, definitely you have to use at least medium gauge to go down to the drop tunings. And you may even want to get heavy gauge banjo strings. Anyhow. So the other thing you can do is try not dropping it all the way down to F. Try tuning to F sharp. That's what I do. If I'm on a banjo that can't handle all the way down to F, I'll do F sharp, and it still sounds a little bit lower, and I can sing better with it. John Welburn said, I recently purchased a banjo from you, and I loved the strings. What kind do you put on your banjos? John, I can't remember what kind of banjo I sold you. If it was a banjo that I made, I pretty much always used the Lobella number 17 nylons, or I was using those exclusively because those were the cheapest nylon strings available. So if you bought a banjo that I made for you, it's very likely that it was Lobella number 17. Those are sort of a light gauge nylon, medium light. If you bought a banjo that I made for you more recently, It probably had Nile gut strings on it, just the standard Nile gut, like heavy gauge nylon strings. Actually, me personally, I don't like those as much, but they were cheaper this last time around, so I bought those. If you bought sort of a more contemporary antique banjo from me, I have no idea what would be on there. What I like to use is just the straight medium gauge they call phosphor bronze strings. They have that bronze wound fourth, the phosphor bronze. I think it's from Labella or Diodario, one of those. It's cheaper, and I don't get expensive strings. So if you really like some metal strings I gave you, they're probably the phosphor bronze. Those do sound a lot nicer than some of the metal strings out there. But John, get back to me and let me know if there's more detail there. I'll try to answer your question better. Thanks, Benjamin. Do you have to alter your hand positions at all when transitioning to nylon strings? I don't really think so. You'll notice there's some differences. Nylon doesn't respond to certain things as well as steel does. Just like steel strings don't respond to certain attacks as there's differences is what I'm trying to say. So one thing you'll notice with the nylon strings is when you go to do a choke or a bend, it's real understated. If I did this lick on a steel string banjo, it would be like wow, wow, really exaggerated. But when you do a bend on a fretless or a nylon strung banjo, they're understated. So instead of doing bends on these, I'll slide. You'll notice that. You'll notice there's just going to be more play. There's less tension in them. But as far as actually having to alter your hand positions or your hand movements, no, I don't think so. It's just you'll pretty quickly be able to transition over, and you'll realize if it's something for you or not. Okay. Ethan asks, what are my favorite minor key tunes? East Virginia out of GDGCD is my favorite dark sounding tune, closely followed by Cluck Old Hen. I recently picked up a really hot Cluck Old Hen from George Gibson. I've known George all my life, and I've heard him play this tune all my life, but he never called it Cluck Old Hen. He never sang the words to it. So Cluck Old Hen is really good. A lot of, we think of Cluck Old Hen as being kind of a tacky, festival tune or something like that, or beginner's tune, but it's just an old classic piece, and you can make it sound badass. If you just have to get away from the tablature and stuff. If you look at a tab for Cluck Old Hen, it's going to sound like Cluck Old Hen, cluck and sing, doop, 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 doop. But if you learn Cluck Old Hen from, a real OG like George Gibson, somebody like that, or off an old recording, learn Cluck Old Hen from a damn recording, or if you can find an OG in person, learn from them. Anyhow, I'm getting off subject. Yeah, those are great. I mean, what minor key tune isn't great, right? They're all great. Red Rocking Chair is one that I play and sing often. The Cuckoo Bird. That's another killer dance piece that I play and sing often. Does Hills of Mexico count as a minor tune? Anyhow, that's cool. I think they're all great, really. James says, hello from London. I play the guitar, mandolin, and ukulele. Are banjo chords shapes the same as the uke? James, I don't know. So you've got C, G, and D. You got something else. So I don't know, but I've picked up a ukulele recently, and I don't think it's the same, but it's a similar sort of thing. Okay. Quentin wants to know, do you have favorites when it comes to tone ring, pot size, wood combination? I'm starting to develop those preferences. One thing that I'm finding that I prefer for myself is a 12-inch rim banjo. When you get into the, or not 12-inch, an 11-inch rim. When you get into the 12 and even some of like the Minstrel style banjos with a 13-inch or God forbid a 14-inch, you're drastically getting a much different sound. So this is like a typical 11-inch pot. But if you add just one more inch on it and make it a 12, it will utterly change the sound of it. So everybody's heard what the bigger pots do. They mellow the tone. It's deeper. You get maybe more richer bass and stuff like that. But to me, what I've realized lately, playing lots of different banjos, that me personally, I prefer the 11-inch pot. I like less bass, less sustain, less richness. I like my banjo to sound a little bit more dry and almost tacky. To me, I describe the sound not as tacky, but as like it's saucy sounding. It's real rugged and sort of a sharp, pointed sound. And I get that more out of the 11-inch rim than I do out of the 12-inch rim. So for that reason, my current preference is for an 11-inch rim. I think once you start getting down into the 10, like a 10-inch rim or a 9-inch rim, then you start getting the same thing. You're losing other types of sound. There is a reason, y'all, that the standard rim size is 11 inches, probably because that's what most people find the most pleasing, and I'm no different. I like 11-inch rim. As far as tone rings, I don't care. One thing that I'm starting to think with, those Dobson tone rings that are real popular now, like it's real hip now, that's got that brass bell shape back here. I think those sound much better with nylon strings. I think it's if you put steel strings and all that on there, that's fine. But I think that bell sheet metal brass Dobson tone ring, where it really shines, is with nylon strings, for example. So there's stuff like that. You're asking about wood combinations. If you pick up a banjo that's all walnut, and then you pick up that same banjo and it's all maple, the maple has a sharper report to it. It's like it cracks louder. Like if I had a solid maple bridge on here and my bridge collapses while I'm picking, it will make your ears ring. It's like really loud. If I have a solid walnut bridge on here and it collapses while I'm picking, it doesn't make your ears ring. It's a more mellow thump. It's not like a maple bridge collapsing on a hide. Almost sounds like the report of a gun. I mean, it's like crack. So there's stuff like that. Walnut is a much more mellower sounding wood as opposed to, say, maple. And there is a reason why, like this banjo, the standard banjo that we've all settled on over the years is an 11-inch rim, and it's all maple construction because maple has that sharp cracking report that we associate with banjos. We've come to associate with banjos. It wasn't always that way. So I think for an earlier, more old-fashioned banjo sound, like my homemade banjos, I prefer to make them out of walnut than anything else because it looks old and dark, and it imparts that old and dark flavor to the sound. If you make something out of maple, it just cracks. It's louder and sharper and stuff, which I actually prefer for a modern banjo. Okay, so wow, the fire is cranking. Yeah, it is. It's going to warm up today, but to do this Q&A, I wanted to have a little bit of fire going. Molly wants to know how she can purchase one of my banjos. Well, Molly, you just have to, you can send me a message if you get on YouTube here and you go to my channel where it says about. You can click on a thing that says contact or email or whatever, and it'll show you my email address. You can email me. And that's one way. Just get a hold of me. Tell me what you want. I need to know your price range and basically what kind of banjo you're looking for. And then I will do my best to run my matchmaking service. I know there's a lot of people out there that have sent me those requests and I haven't gotten them a banjo, but it's just, I have a lot of requests and people are real particular about what they buy, but I'm trying to get a banjo to everybody that's contacted me. I want to put banjos in your hands. This banjo is for sale, by the way. This is a pretty decent, we think 1920s Slingerland banjo, solid maple. It's sort of a higher end Slingerland. Anyhow, any banjo you see me with is probably for sale. You just gotta get a hold of me. Okay. Nick wants to know what banjo fads / misinformation will I'll be happy to see fade away. You know, we're in the process of watching the what I call the minstrel first theory fade away. That was a theory that was held for a long time through my childhood, through much of my life, until really very recently. And that myth held that the minstrels were the white minstrels who painted themselves black, were the ones who brought the banjo from enslaved banjo players on the plantations and stuff to basically what the white working class. So people would say things like the banjo was introduced to Appalachia after the Civil War by blackface minstrels. People said that for a long time, and that is not true. And people said it when they didn't know any better, but then information started to come out. You had people like Dina Epstein, George Gibson, Cecilia Conway, and others who had all kinds of research they were amassing that said the banjo's been in Appalachia since the 1700s, at least. We know for a fact the banjo entered East Kentucky in 1781 with the first large caravan of slaves from Virginia. We know that. So so that was a myth, and people hung on to it for way too long. Finally, now that we've come out with Banjo Roots and Branches, you know, nobody is taken seriously anymore who tries to say that white minstrels brought the banjo to Appalachia or to the South or whatever. That's nonsense. The only place white minstrels brought the banjo to was over to England, where, as far as we know, they really didn't have any banjo tradition prior to that. But here in the United States, we already had it. Anyhow, I'm very happy to see that lie fading away. There's other, you know, misconceptions. One thing is, you know, we all talk about Clawhammer today. We all think we play Clawhammer banjo. Clawhammer, as a descriptor for the down-picking banjo style, did not emerge until the 1960s. That is the cold fact of the matter. If you go and research the word clawhammer associated with the banjo, you really won't find much before 1960. What you do find before 1960 is they called three-finger picking, and that was called clawhammer for some reason early on. And then by 1960, that was then folklorists then erroneously painted with a broad brush and called, basically the old time style was clawhammer, which meant this. And so then it turned into clawhammer banjo contests, and Clarence Ashley was one of the first tradition bearers to adopt the term. And then once people like Ralph Stanley and stuff started saying it, that was just the way it is. But I would like people to be more aware of that. And I don't really care about the terminology. What I care about is the style itself. There is still a misconception in many banjo circles today that people think there's only, you know, one way to play the banjo. You know, there's only there's right tunings and wrong tunings. There's right techniques, wrong techniques. Now we're seeing this thing. There's our songs that you can sing, and there's songs that you can't sing, depending on who you are. All these rules and stuff, which don't have anything to do with our tradition. So I'll be very happy to see that bullshit die out. I hope I live to see it. Let's see. I'm still here, James. If you're having an interruption, it's not on my end. So Brent says, speaking of the minstrels, where do you stand on the minstrel repertoire? I've heard folks say we shouldn't play Stephen Foster songs, for example. Well, Brent, I think if you don't want to play minstrel music or Stephen Foster pieces, then you shouldn't. Because, I mean, you should be very careful about where you play this stuff, right? So me personally, I'm lazy about it. It's easy for me because I never really liked Stephen Foster, and I never liked minstrel banjo. You know, I got into minstrel banjo long enough I picked up a copy of the Briggs Manual. I learned the coon hunt walk around, and then I started learning the next song, which was I think called the Grapevine Twist, attributed to Joel Sweeney. Bullshit. Anyhow, once I got on the second tune, I was like, this is not for me. I didn't like the way it sounded. It doesn't sound old to me. It doesn't strike me as being much older than about the 1850s. I think it's 19th century pop music. So I never wanted to play minstrel music. I never wanted to play Stephen Foster. So when I hear like one of the old timey hipsters, you know, get up and preach and say that, you know, Stephen Foster was a racist, we shouldn't play his music, I'm like, okay, like I wasn't playing his shit anyhow. You know, I'm not a racist. I am anti-racist staunchly to the death. So let's just put that to bed. But that being said, I'm not afraid of tunes like Dixie. I'm not afraid of Run, Jimmy, Run, you know, Shave a Dead Man, all these pieces like that. Of course, people should still play the music. Change the title, take out the racist words. If you're going to sing it, you know, don't sing racist bullshit, you know, blah, blah, blah. Now, on the other hand of that, this music is in the historical record. It's still recorded. That means it's worth studying. So if you're in a proper environment and you have you know, an audience where everybody has agreed beforehand, hey, we know that we're going to watch a bunch of white guys paint themselves up black and start dropping N-bombs and singing crazy minstrel stuff, people need to know you're going to do that beforehand, right? You can't just do that shit to an audience. That's called, you know, you're abusing the audience. It's very bad. So nobody does that. But so like if there's some group of people who get together and say they want to paint themselves up black and experience the 19th century minstrel show, for example, you know, I guess I have nothing against that. As long as everybody involved knows what they're getting into. It's kind of like you're getting into an orgy or something. You know, as long as everybody's a consenting adult, you know, regardless of color, so what? And I've told some of you before, I actually have seen a blackface minstrel show before with a complete minstrel lineup. You had tambourine, fiddle, guitar, banjo. They were a bunch of white boys that painted themselves up black. This was in Perryville, Kentucky in about 2005 or 2006. This is a group called the Allendale Melodians. So, and I know some of the guys through, because I was a Civil War reenactor. So apparently, you know, these guys are, some of the guys in that band, at least one of them is like a real racist asshole. And so that kind of, you know, they're not doing it right. But the way they did it at that show, this was a long time ago, those guys were doing basically minstrel shows all day for the public at the reenactment, but they weren't painted up. And they had a flyer that they were putting the word out saying, hey, tonight at, you know, 11 o'clock or whatever at the theater tent, we're going to be putting on the real minstrel show. If you want to see something like that, we're going to do it. And that's how it was. So I showed up and I stepped in the back door and I sat on a bench in the very back with some buddies of mine, and we took that in. And I want to say that there was actually black people in the audience because this was a big reenactment, and there were black reenactors at the reenactment, and they weren't excluded from the event. So I know there was at least one black reenactor in the audience, and maybe more. So I bring this up. It's an uncomfortable subject. It was uncomfortable for me watching. I sat in the back and I drank and smoked copiously and just observed, kind of ethnographer style, I guess, what was going on. Anyhow, so there's that. I don't know what to think about it. I mean, if I was black, I'd probably be fucking pissed off about it. But I don't know. Because like I said, there was the one black guy in the audience who was a reenactor who felt comfortable enough to sit in there and take it all in, and nobody harassed him or anything, but it still didn't seem, it doesn't seem right to me to paint yourself up and caricature your brothers and sisters in that manner. So it's something that I would never do. But like, do I think it should be outlawed? No. This is America. It's a fucked up country, guys. Oh, so Michael says he just got his first banjo, partially my fault. And he's wondering if it'd be easier, if it would be a mistake to try to learn overhand and two finger at the same time. Well, Michael, I've actually had that question before and I've answered it. No, go ahead and go for it. That's how I learned banjo. I was actually learning three finger scrug style, and I quit that and couldn't figure out clawhammer. So I started doing two finger. And then once I figured out the overhand style, I've been learning, I'm still to this day learning two finger and overhand at the same time. And I don't think it's hurt me much. It'll only help you. And you'll find that when you get, sometimes as a young player, you just get so fed up with the overhand, you get tired of it, you don't think it sounds good. Well, if you can also two finger pick, then that gives you one more reason to stay interested in your banjo and play something different. The same thing, if you're a two finger picker and you get tired of, or a bluegrass picker, to get tired of it, learn another style at the same time. There's nothing to stop you from doing that. There's a lot of discouragement that goes on from like banjo teachers, I think music teachers in general, because we see people over the years who pick up an instrument and they lose interest and they quit. And so we try to think of ways to keep people interested in the instrument. So we come up with rules. Say if you do X, Y, Z, you'll maintain interest and you'll keep playing. So, but most of that's bullshit. People talk about, if you hear somebody talking about bad habits and how, hey, that's a bad habit, that's going to cause problems for you later down the line. I wouldn't listen to that. Usually that's bullshit. You don't play like they do. There's really not many bad habits. And bad habits on the banjo, they don't really turn into habits usually, because if it's really bad and it's really detrimental to your playing, you won't do it for very long. It'll be uncomfortable. You'll find a way around it. So don't listen very much to banjo gurus and teachers talking about the right and wrong way to do stuff, or bad habits, or people who try to discourage you from learning multiple things at once. Go for it. If you can, do it. Evan asks me, have you read Dan Emmett and the Rise of Early Negro Minstrelsy? No, Evan, I have not. That is a book that keeps coming up. I need to read that book, because that's an older book, right? I need to read that book. My problem is, try as I may, I don't find the minstrels very interesting. There is some interesting things about what they did and where it went, and the process and all that, and some of the mystery behind it. But mostly I have a hard time just getting interested in them enough. Like I said, I wasn't really interested to learn a lot of their music, and so far I haven't been interested enough to pick up a copy of that book. But that does sound like it's a good book. And if I want to be up here talking trash about the minstrels, then I should probably read that book, right? Jake B asks if I can speak to the history of traditional banjo in Pennsylvania. Are there any meaningful regional differences in old-time style? Well, Jake, I wouldn't know of a traditional banjo tradition in Pennsylvania that would have existed prior to, I don't know. I mean, so my understanding, the reason that we have the richness of banjo styles in the South is because of slavery. Enslaved African Americans are the ones who mostly played these things back in the day. So where they went, the banjo went with them, and anybody who heard the banjo, enough wanted to hear it more. And it wasn't long before crackers wanted to play it themselves. So I don't know. I don't think that transition ever occurred in Pennsylvania, except after the minstrel shows. But minstrel shows mostly only went to the urban centers, right? Like New York City, Baltimore. It's mostly in the urban centers. So you didn't even really get a lot of banjo exposure in like rural Pennsylvania, I wouldn't think, until well after the minstrels were over. Once you get to like the golden era of classic banjo and like ragtime and stuff, that's probably when people in rural Pennsylvania first started really noticing the banjo. I would guess for a long time. I mean, we have banjo sightings in 18th century Pennsylvania, but it seems like when slavery died out in Pennsylvania, so did the banjo. Just like, when slavery ended in the South, a lot of banjo picking ended too, Anyhow, it's a complex issue. My only traditional music I've heard from Pennsylvania is fiddling. I think that was pretty much a fiddle tradition, because I don't think you had that Afro-Caribbean influence in Pennsylvania folk music. I could be wrong, but I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know where to find traditional Pennsylvania banjo from before 1960. So Ben says, I play old time music myself, and you say the clawhammer is a term that arose in the 60s. What was it called previously? So Ben, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but prior to the folk revivals, urban folk revivals, which were mostly instigated by academics, well after the Civil War, mostly we think of the 1950s folk revival. And if y'all haven't noticed, we're in the middle of a folk revival right now. We're going through the same cycle is happening again. People are attempting to revive lost traditions by participating in the new festival old time tradition. Very complex stuff that a lot of people are going to disagree with me on. So what was clawhammer called back in the day before 1960? Well, most people just called it playing the banjo. But we have tons of names. So in Southeast Kentucky, the most common historic name seems to have been overhand. Overhand was a very common term in Southeast Kentucky. And since I learned most of my music from a Kentuckian, George Gibson, I've decided I've moved away from the clawhammer term, and I call it overhand now. I'm not saying that everybody else has to call it overhand. I wouldn't want you to, because then I'd be less special, right? So, and clawhammer is a functional term now. When you say clawhammer, everybody knows what you're talking about, So go on, keep using clawhammer, but I'm getting away from the term. I won't use it myself, because like I said, it wasn't used before 1960. Frailing, you mentioned, frailing is a term that's also shrouded in some mystery. It also appeared around the same time. For some reason, Pete Seeger was a champion of the term frailing. Pete is now dead, and as far as I know, he never explained where he got that term frailing from. Now, this is all research that George Gibson has done, and I can't give away too much because he hasn't published this one yet. But basically, the term frailing doesn't appear to be that old either. It's probably the closest thing we can find historically is flailing, F-L-A-I-L, to flail something. Now, that's an old traditional term for beating the husks off of wheat and stuff. They used to have those flails in the medieval days. You'd see them beating that wheat. So that is probably a traditional term that was used somewhere, flailing, and maybe that's where Pete heard it and he called it frailing. So if you ask me, I think the term frailing comes from Pete Seeger. I'm not 100% on that. It may be a traditional term, but I think flailing was probably the traditional term. So other terms that were used, if a person was an overhand picker who dropped their thumb to an interior string, that style has always been called drop thumb. So if you drop thumb, you can say you play drop thumb. You know. Also, a real widespread term was hoedown banjo. They've been using the term hoedown to talk about dance and banjo playing since the 1700s. I just looked at I read an account, a letter from a Confederate soldier in the Civil War just the other day, who was saying some of his friends came into camp and they had a banjo and they put on an old-fashioned Virginia hoedown. So hoedown was a term that was used to describe both the dance and the style of banjo playing. There's tons of terms, and if you go into the African American community, you hear other terms like they called it clubbing, or club-fisted style, or the fisted style, or thumping, rapping. Rapping is one I've heard, R-A-P-P, rapping. You hear that, and that's a term that was used in North Alabama. I know Ernie Williams told me that the old timer he learned from called it rapping. Do you rap the banjo? That's what the old timer said. So to answer your question, Ben, there was as many banjo players as there were. That's how many terms there were for it back in the day. So that's one reason I get a little fired up when people try to pigeonhole all of us into clawhammer. It's just not accurate. That represents a cultural bottleneck. You guys know what I'm talking about when I say bottleneck? It's like you have this great big bottle full of whiskey. There's all this beautiful whiskey in it, and then there's the bottleneck, which is about that big. And all that beautiful whiskey can't pass through that little bottleneck. So what do? They pick and choose. Only certain things come through the bottleneck. That's a term I learned in studying genetics and archaeology. Here's a good question. Inquisitor Jones says, Clifton, what's the wildest place you've ever played? I played some wild places. Y'all know I played on the battlefield in Iraq. I played on a tank. I played inside of Bradley in an M113 when mortar rounds were exploding outside. But that's not the wildest place I've played. I played in the 1930s Nazi army barracks in Germany for a bunch of soldiers who were tripping out on mushrooms. I've done that many times. That was pretty wild. But probably the wildest places I've played, when I went up into East Kentucky when I first got out of the Army, I fell in with a rough bunch of guys that I knew from the Army who were living in East Kentucky near George Gibson. They gave me a job on a septic tank pumping truck that they ran. So I rode with those boys, and I have to tell you all, in those days I was a drug abuser, and these guys were too. These guys were straight up pill addicts, like opiate. They were addicted to opiates, right? Like Percocet and stuff like that. So I ran with those boys for a couple of weeks when I first came home from the Army. And I carried my banjo with them, and I don't even remember some of the places we played. They had me playing in bars. They were driving me around, taking me up to people's little cabins and trailers and stuff, and getting me to pick for them. And we were snorting pills and drinking a lot of alcohol. That was pretty wild. But probably the wildest place I ever played was at a meth house in Oklahoma. That was pretty wild. I'm not proud of that, but I was using meth at the time, and I was in South Oklahoma visiting Army friends. It's kind of, I got into drugs when I was in the Army, and when I came home, I went and visited all my old friends in places like Kentucky, Oklahoma, California, and we just did a lot of drugs. And I was a banjo picker, so I was picking the banjo. But probably the craziest place was at that meth house in Oklahoma. There was all kinds of people there, black people, white people, and I was methed up out of my mind, and I played like crazy. Played at a similar sort of like trap kind of a drug house I don't know what you call that, up in, I did the same thing up in Missouri on that same trip. I mean, there was a while there where I was playing in some wild places, but I haven't done anything like that in a while. If anybody, I don't use drugs anymore, y'all. I'm over it. I'm doing things differently now, but there was a period there where I could have gone a bad way. So Nick says, yeah, most Pennsylvania banjo history is classic banjo due to people like S.S. Stewart. Yeah, you guys in Pennsylvania, that's where in Boston and Philadelphia is where those were the two epicenters of classic banjo building for a long time. You had S.S. Stewart and Fairbanks and Cole, and those guys had a serious rivalry. They hated each other, and then they also. Stewart hated everybody. He had big beef with Buckby and Dobson in New York. Also, those guys, he hated the Dobson brothers. And then also out in Chicago, that was the other place. You had Line and Healy, and you had J.B. Shaw out in Chicago that were big ribs. James Donaldson asks if I know any tunes from Florida. I don't. About the closest that I can think of something that's like a quintessential Florida tune. I mean, I did learn a version of Lonesome Road Blues, that song, I'm going down the road feeling bad. There's a version called the Florida Blues that sings about, I'm going where the orange blossoms grow. I'm going where the Swanee River flows. Anyhow, stuff like that. So there are Florida songs like that. One thing is Bo Wilkie, the guitar player I was just playing with recently, he turned me on to some field recordings out of South Georgia, the Okefenokee Swamp, which is actually one of my childhood stomping grounds. If y'all know me, I was born in Jacksonville, but I grew up in Savannah early on, and we went into the Okefenokee a lot. So Mike Seeger, I think, or no, disregard that. It's some state archive somewhere in Georgia or something. They have all these field recordings that were made in the Okefenokee Swamp, and it's all kind of stuff. But if you want to find Florida music, get onto a website called Florida Memory. Florida Memory. If you go on the Florida Memory website, you can search sound recordings, and you can type in, you'll get all kinds of recordings made at folk festivals and field recordings. On my Facebook, if you can sift through all that bullshit that was going on and go down on my Facebook, I posted recently a link to a collection of field recordings that were actually made in Florida in Glades County in 1940. There's Native American music on there, there's black music on there, and there's white music on there. It's some good material. You should check it out if you want Florida stuff. Pennsyltucky Reb says, yes, there were slaves in Pennsylvania also. Yes, I'm aware of that, Mr. Reb. But what I'm saying is the slavery in Pennsylvania died out pretty early on. And I think with it, as people migrated west into the Pennsylvania mountains, you don't have a banjo tradition in those Pennsylvania mountains like you do in the southern mountains, for example. Am I right? I don't think you guys, I mean, you say you're Pennsyltucky Reb, so I'm assuming you're from rural Pennsylvania, from central Pennsylvania. And I don't think that there was a banjo tradition there that existed historically before like classic banjo and bluegrass and stuff. And I think the reason for that is because as people migrated into the Appalachian Mountains and places like Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, slavery was very much on. And so enslaved banjoists were carried up into the southern mountains with my ancestors. They drug them up there and learned the music from them that way. And I think as people were migrating west into the Pennsylvania mountains, you didn't have anywhere near the level of enslaved people being coerced and drugged with them. Hence, you don't get, I think that's why there isn't a very old banjo tradition up there. I could be wrong, but I don't know when slavery ended in Pennsylvania either. Can you talk more about the folk? Brody says, can I talk more about the folk revival of the 50s and the folk scare? Why were folk artists of the past oftentimes leftists politically? Artists like Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie come to mind. Well, I think folk artists often tend to be leftists because leftist politics is grassroots, real leftist politics. There's fake leftist politics. I hate to, I know some of y'all want me to do this, but people like Cameron DeWitt, Jake Blunt, people like that are what I would call fake leftists. So that's not grassroots. That's some kind of weird authoritarian, identitarianism that they're pushing. They're co-opting folk music and attempting to co-opt left politics. But I don't want to get a bunch of negativity on here. You're asking about the 50s and 60s, and I think people like Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and Nina Simone and people back in the day, those are examples of what I would call real leftists. People who actually had the authentic working class background that people like DeWitt and Blunt frankly lack. They don't come from a working class background, and neither did Pete Seeger. But Pete was one of these people. You don't have to have that background. Pete was actually a man of the fucking people, And then of course Woody, blue collar to the core. So it's no surprise that people like Woody Guthrie, when they met socialists, anarchists, communists in the folk music scene, it's no surprise that they sympathized with those people. Because if you come from a real working class background, you've probably been screwed over by companies and the government and by rich people. And you're going to blame somebody for that. And you either blame other poor people like yourself, and then you become a right-winger, or you blame rich, powerful elites, and you become a left-winger. That's the way I see it. That's real leftism, as I see it. So of course they were drawn to that stuff. Look at a guy like Leadbelly, for example. Racism and the corrupt state had basically ruined that man's life until he was able to use his music to get out of that situation that he'd been placed in. So of course, folk musicians are drawn to leftism. I'm a fucking leftist, believe it or not. No, Jake says there was actually a decent population of black miners in Southwest and Northeast PA, but not a lot of banjo playing. He's only found post-1920s banjo playing. Yeah, I think you're going to find a lot of fiddle music in Pennsylvania, I think. Sorry, Okie Rahab. I got to bring up Oklahoma. The one time I was in a meth house, but it's a true story. That was in outside of Holdenville, Oklahoma, South Oklahoma. And that was, people in those days, the meth heads were just walking around out in the open like zombies. It was crazy. Steve asks me if my homosexual boyfriend enjoys the banjo too. Well, Steve, I'm actually straight as far as I know. I don't have a boyfriend, but I have men who are friends, and to be my friend, you usually have to enjoy the banjo. So I'm going to say yes. Quentin says he loved Matt Kinman's take on Brother Green. Would you like to play a version of this tune in the future? Yes, Quentin. Just last night on this banjo, I worked up a new version of Brother Green that you're going to like. It's different. My first version that I learned from Buell Casey in straight G tuning, and then Matt Kinman, he plays it in double C. I twisted my banjo into F sharp D, F sharp A D, and played Brother Green out of the Rubin tuning, and it's pretty cool. So stand by. I'm going to do that for y'all. I've got a lot of requests to do Brother Green, and we're going to do it in the old Rubin tuning. Oh boy, Steve, if you're going to like troll, buddy, we'll remove you. But yeah, they drugged blacks up to Appalachia. They did. That's exactly what they did. They put chains on them and they drug them up there. And they drug the banjo with them. It happened about 1781 was when the first enslaved banjoist came into Kentucky. We have that documented. So let's see. Humana Story says, well, he just says good morning. Johnny G29 says, have you heard of a banjo manufacturer called J.E. Dallas? A friend of mine found an old banjo in a shed with that name stamped up. No, Johnny, I've never heard of J.E. Dallas. If you have some pictures of it, I would take pictures of it, post it on the banjohangout.org forum. There's a sub forum in there called the Collector's Corner. If I ever find something and I can't figure out what it is, I post pictures in there, and one of those old guys will jump right on there and tell you what it is. But it could be that it's just a lot, people just ordered stuff. If you had something like, if you ordered 10 banjos from Buckbee, they would stamp anything on it that you asked, for example. So it may not even be a maker. Jake says, better read than dead. That's true. Fife tradition, yeah. Damn, Rob, if you're further south than Holdenville, buddy, you're down there. Okay, None Such wants me to post a left-hand close-up video of East Virginia. Damn it. If you'll remind me again, None Such, I'll make a note of that. I'm away from a pen and paper right now, but I want to do whatever y'all want. Oh, Dave Lowe says, to somebody who asked, Johnny, you asked about the J.E. Dallas. Dave Lowe down here says that he thinks they're an English company from the turn of the century. So that'd be somewhere to look. Well, y'all, we've been doing this for about an hour and 40 minutes. Steve says, in the homosexual community, I'd be considered a twink, but if I grew out a beard, I'd be an otter. Yeah, Steve, I've heard all that stuff before. I had a beard very recently. You might prefer that. Patrick says he's calling in from 5th period AP physics class in Long Island, New York. Hell yeah, buddy. Well, if you're skipping school to fuck around with some banjos, you know what I'm all about. Maybe I'll try to retune this. Trying to get into the Rubin tuning. And what was the tune y'all wanted to hear, Brother Green? Brother Green, come kneel by me, for I am shot and bleeding. Stay, brother, stay, lay me away, and write my wife a letter. That's what I'm working on. This is super low right now. I could barely hit those low notes. Angry Dumpster Dude asks if I'm a communist. No, I'm not a communist. I'm probably, if I'm anything, you might have to call me an anarchist, because I don't like communists. I don't get along with the socialists. I don't like Democrats. I don't like Republicans. So if I had to have a label, I probably would call myself an anarchist. And anarchy, y'all, it doesn't mean just like madness and going around and free for all. You know, anarchy comes from the word hierarchy. There's hierarchy, and then the opposite of hierarchy is anarchy. We don't have hierarchy. Everybody's equal. All anarchy means to me is equality, which is what I think we're all after. I think he's, yeah. How long did it take you to learn the banjo? Well, humanist story. I'm still, learning is a lifelong process, right? But how long did it take me to actually be able to, for me to actually be comfortable with the banjo? That took a long time. That took years. You know, I've been playing for 21 years or something now. So I don't know. But I could pick it up and play a tune after one summer, I guess. So it didn't take me that long, but before I actually called myself a banjo player, it probably took me 3 or 4 years before I called myself a banjo player. You know, and now it took me 20 years before I would actually had the courage to call myself a banjoist. I've only recently felt comfortable enough to say that. Curtis asks if I give Skype lessons. I have in the past. I will in the future. I have to do it for a very limited number of people. I've got 3 or 4 students right now that I'm working with. But Curtis, if it's something you're really interested in, contact me somehow, and you can get my attention that way. You can get on the About section of the YouTube channel, and you can find my email address in there. We could try to work out a time. I find that it's not ideal teaching over Skype. We know that going into it, but it is better than nothing. So if you really need help, then yeah, I'm willing to work with you. Jay Schmidt asked, does banjo have its place in the blues scene? I think it does. Sure. I mean, if you're asking me, I'm of the opinion that the blues came from the banjo, right? I think blues was first played on a banjo. So I think, of course, the banjo has its place in the blues scene. Now, why isn't there much banjo in the blues scene? There's all kinds of reasons for that, right? I think most black people for a long time have not wanted to be associated with the banjo. That's my perception, and I can understand why. So, and blues is a black art form, and if you don't want to play something that you associate with being racist, then you ain't gonna fucking play it, right? So I don't blame anybody for that, but it does. I would love to see some 5-string banjo or 6-string banjo introduced into the blues scene. Somebody asked me if I play any other instruments beside banjo. If you can pull up some videos of me playing guitar, there's one where I'm playing 2-finger guitar like it's a banjo. I've retuned like Roscoe Holcomb. You retune the guitar like a banjo, and if you tune to something like DAD, GAD, you can play some extremely bluesy sounding music on a 6-string banjo. And you guys have heard me and other people play some really bluesy sounding music on a regular 5-string banjo. So I would love to see it. That would be really cool. And I know there's some people who are probably there's a cat I've seen. His name is Buffalo Nichols. He's a musician that I've seen online, and he does a lot of early blues stuff. And I know he's starting to pick the banjo too. I'm not sure where he's going with that, but if anybody was going to do it, that Buffalo Nichols cat, he might do it. Willie says, hello from Wales. Hell yeah, I'm glad to have you. I've been to Wales. I went to Holyhead or Holyhead, Wales, and got stuck at the ferry station for like 10 hours in what y'all call a gale, in one of those bad storms. So I didn't get to see as much of Wales as I would like. I would love to go back. I would love to go back to Europe, especially back to England someday, because England is where the majority of my ancestors came from. England and Ireland and the British Isles. So I'd love to go back and do a proper tour and hit up more of the countryside. I'd love to go to Wales. Would love to. Um, yeah. So Humana Story says, do I trust myself enough to play in more entertaining settings, like at Disney World or something? um, I could. I've done some stuff like that, and I can keep from cussing and keep it together and things like that. I don't like to be associated with corporations. I don't like doing corporate jobs and playing corporate gigs. Recently with that country music documentary that came out, I saw a Bank of America advertising that actually featured some old time traditional folk musicians, I guess you might call them, that I actually know. And I was shocked to see them on a Bank of America ad. Uh, Anybody who knows me knows that I hate the bank. Yeah, Evan says for contemporary banjo blues, look up Taj Mahal. Yeah, I'd look up Taj Mahal. That dude's pretty cool. Quentin says, I seem to mostly play two-finger thumb lead. What's my opinion on index lead? I think index lead is great. There's a guy, was it Ed Teague? He was a two-finger banjo picker who might have been mostly index lead. But I switch back and forth. I pretty much approach everything from a thumb lead perspective. I think thumb lead is easier and it's just smoother, more intuitive for me. But if I need to, I'll switch to an index finger lead. And so my whole thing is my thumb stays on the fifth string, the bass string, and the third string. And my index finger only picks the second and first string. So if a measure starts on the first or second string, then I become a finger lead player for that measure or two. But if most of the songs start on the third string or the bass string or something, and then it's a thumb lead. Wow, this is a lot, guys. I didn't think there was going to be this much response. It's overwhelming. I'm glad that you're all here with me this morning. So Evan Carey asks, what is the future of East Kentucky banjo styles? Evan, to get an answer on that, you need to ask an East Kentuckian. You need to ask George Gibson, or Brett Ratliff is somebody who could tell us where he thinks the future of East Kentucky banjo styles is heading. John Haywood could tell us. But anyhow, you've asked me, what do I think the future is? I think it looks really good. Everything that I see up there in Kentucky, I haven't been up there in years, but everything that I see coming out of it on the internet or hear coming out of it, it's good. There's diversity still. They're getting their diversity back. People are interested. Everybody knows who Lee Sexton and George Gibson are. Everybody knows about Lily Mae Ledford and Cousin Emmy. They know about the history now, and they know that it's not just bluegrass. It doesn't just end with bluegrass. It goes back much further. And that is because of the efforts of people like Brett, John, Kevin Howard, George Gibson, and some of the other people up there in that scene, like Sarah Wood, and all the people, I'm forgetting their names, I'm sorry, but I think the future of East Kentucky banjo is really looking good. And there's the Cowan Creek Music School that's getting more popular all the time. We have people coming from all over the country to study at the Cowan Creek Mountain Music School. So that's a big thing too. We have young banjoists like Nora Brown, a young girl who's mostly lived in New York City most of her life. She is now coming down to East Kentucky to learn from the masters, people like George Gibson and Lee Sexton directly. And so that gal is going to go back out to the world, and she is going to show all kinds of people all over the world. I'm getting preachy. But that girl, I'm proud of her. She's going to go out all over the world and show people, obscure Southern American banjo styles, and what she's mostly into is Southeast Kentucky banjo. So I'm proud of that. I'm not worried about the future of Kentucky banjo styles. Oh, Jonas asks if I've ever listened to Richie Stearns. I did just recently. Somebody recommended Richie Stearns to me, and I pulled up some of his stuff on the internet and listened to it. I like it. That's a good musician, and he's from Pennsylvania or something like that. I like it, and I was mostly hearing original stuff from him, and I thought it was pretty good. TE says, how many bitches can I expect to slay once I learn banjo? If you're slaying bitches, you need to file a police report. Owen. Yeah. Oh, and you're from East Kentucky. I figured you were asking about a Ledford. How old is George Gibson and how is he traveling age-wise? George is about 80 years old. He was born in 1938, and he's in better condition than most 80-year-olds, I think. You know, he's a fairly active guy. You know, he's gotten older. When I first met him, he was maybe 60 or something. So he's definitely gotten older and stuff. I think he's less interested in banjos and things than he was. But, you know, he ain't never quitting. He'll always be the banjo man. And he'll always be my #1 banjo man. He's doing good. Yeah, he was born in 1938 in a log house. So, yeah, he's had a hell of a fucking life. Quentin asks, do I use a tuner to tighten my banjo head? I don't. I used to. I used to tune my banjo to open F, and then I would tune the banjo head to open F as well, because somebody told me that, a bluegrasser told me that you should do that. So, you know, like, you probably should tune your banjo head, but it's not necessary. Did Roscoe Holcomb ever tune a banjo head? Nah. Did Virgil Anderson? No. Did Odell Thompson ever tune his banjo head? No. So Ben asks if I'm familiar with a traditional musician named Bruce Ling. Apparently, he's written some popular contra tunes in New England. He's one of the best around in Michigan. I've never heard of Bruce Ling. No. Oh, Owen says his grandma was born in a log cabin. I believe it. If you're from East Kentucky, a lot of people's grandparents were still being born in log cabins up until pretty recently. So I believe it, man. Other instruments, I don't really play anything else. I play the 5-string banjo. I'll play a little bit of 4-string banjo, and I play a little bit of guitar. That's about it. I can play Rock of Ages on a harmonica, and I can play the Jew's harp. Bong, bong, bong. I can play that pretty good. I've always been good at that. Yeah. Okay, everybody. This is getting on 2 hours here. I think I'm probably boring y'all to death. I know I've got to get on with some other stuff, but I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. This is the first time I tried to do a live Q&A. It was a big success. We've got 70-something people in here, I guess. So thanks a lot. And I'll try to do this again sometime. And in the meantime, if you like this, be sure to give us the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. If you want to go over on patreon.com/Clifton Hicks, check us out over there too. I'd sure appreciate it. Okay, everybody, thanks for looking. You'll see me soon. I can't answer any more questions. We'll do this again soon. Okay, goodbye, everybody.